Professor Akintoye, welcome and greetings. I hope you are hearing me all right and ready now to come and present your talk to us. So over to you, Professor Akintoye.
Thank you very much. I must start by thanking Dele Ogun for putting this whole program together, and thank all the other persons who have made it possible for him to make a success of it this afternoon. I thank you, our chairlady, for your contributions to this historic moment in the history of the two nations, two great nations, Yoruba and Igbo of Nigeria. I agree entirely with Professor Nwolize that what we should learn to do, what we should use this conference, this afternoon to do, is to look forward rather than look backwards. Because when we look backwards, we are looking at the history of two very highly developed people who allowed themselves to be pitted against each other, and who have propagated that culture of rivalry, even hostility, which some people call a war between their two nations. The Yoruba and the Igbo were not very much in contact before colonial times, but they started to come into very close contact from the last years of the 19th century. By the time Nigeria was amalgamated in 1914, there were fairly good numbers of Igbo people in Lagos and other parts of Yoruba land. And there was no hostility between them. These Yoruba people have a cultural trait that I think the world now knows, namely that they regard foreigners as and strangers in their land as people deserving of welcome, hospitality, and help. And so the history of the Yoruba people is replete with examples of people who came from totally foreign lands and became very important and became even chiefs in Yoruba cities and towns long before the 19th century. And it's all people. Hausa, the Fulani were not very much known about, but Hausa, Nupe, Edo, Bariba, and towards the end of the 19th century, some Igbo began to come. And Igbo and Yoruba were not enemies in those years. They were not at all. There is an account given by my friend and colleague, Professor Dele Afibo, that the Igbo, when they went out of their homeland to go and trade in other people's homelands, had a philosophy of life which says, he who goes out to do business to live, to make a living from going to other people's lands, cannot afford to have enemies in those foreign lands. That was the Igbo philosophy of life. So the Igbo were very polite, very nice to their hosts everywhere they went before European colonialism. And the Yoruba, of course, had a wider reach in the world. They had for centuries been trading north into Hausa land, east into Kanuri land, beyond the Kanuri territory to what is now Sudan and South Sudan, and part of Central African Republic, and many parts of the West African coast. Yeah, but the Yoruba and Igbo were not enemies. When they first met it was the usual Yoruba thing, oh, our brother, which is what the Yoruba believe about all human beings from anywhere. There is a verse in Ifa which says, in Ifa, which is the compendium of Yoruba wisdom, which says, the stranger or foreigner will come, accept him and take care of him and help him. Because in doing so, you are accumulating benefits from for yourself in the house of Olodumare, the God who created the world and rules over the world. That's the philosophy. I can tell story upon stories in about 1780. We have the story of a Hausa man trading in your city of Oyoile, who went into the palace to complain that some Oyo boys had stolen some of his merchandise. And the reaction of the Alaafin was way out. He said, here in this town, treating a foreigner like that. And what he then went to do was terrific. In the Oyo Empire, there were whole chieftaincy titles that were designated to foreigners. And in many Yoruba towns, there are chieftaincy titles that are held by people who are of origin that is not Yoruba. So it is a part. So when the first Igbo people began to come in fairly good numbers in the beginning of the 20th century, it was the same old Yoruba attitude and the same Igbo attitude. The Igbo attitude I said earlier on, and I was quoting from my friend Dele, former professor of history at University of Nigeria. He said the general attitude of the Igbo who left the homeland, who left the cultural area to go to any other place, among other people, was he who goes out of the homeland, he who goes out of the cultural area cannot afford to have enemies out there. I must be friendly with everybody. And that meant being polite, earning love and respect and cooperation and help wherever they went. That's the nature, that's the true nature of the Igbo people. All the aggressive attitudes that people have been complaining is all a product of colonial times. A product especially of a tradition that started in the 1930s. Dele Ogun has a book, Fatherless People, and there is a small account in it of Zeke returning from America in 1933 with very highly blown ideas of Pan-Africanism, the black man in the world, and so on and so forth. But he was vulnerable. He was a poor person, and he wasn't getting the kind of help that he desired. He had applied for jobs to many organizations and many agencies back home in Nigeria, and none of them had given me a job. And he arrived in London on his way back home, and that vulnerability put him in the hands of the colonial authorities. Basically, what happened, the British respected the Yoruba, but they didn't particularly like the kind of black man that the Yoruba were. They didn't like it, because by the time they came, the Yoruba were already fairly highly educated. They had been producing graduates from the last years of the 1850s. And by the time that the British began to come into Yoruba land in the 1880s, 1890s, there were already very many Yoruba graduates in very many areas of life. And when the British finally became the rulers of Nigeria, I'm jumping over a whole lot of things. They didn't fancy the Yoruba at all. They might be friends with the individual Yoruba people, because the educated people for them to be friends with were mostly Yoruba. But they feared that the Yoruba were going to make the profits of colonialism difficult to achieve in Nigeria, that the Yoruba will bar the way to the earnings from the British enterprise in Nigeria. Because essentially all these things we call new countries, they were trading arrangements. Winston Churchill said in 1902, we didn't go to Africa to build countries. We went there to trade. And that's the truth. We went to Africa to trade. So people thinking that, oh, these people came and created countries for us. They didn't create countries for us. They created trading establishments for themselves. And that's why when the British took over, they began to discourage the indigenous traders in places like Lagos and up the Niger. Because this is our venture and the purpose is trade. So the British didn't particularly like the Yoruba and thought that they needed to subdue the interests of the influence of the Yoruba people in Nigeria. And according to the account in the book that I have quoted, Fatherless People, Marjorie Pelham, who was a scholar of the colonial establishment, got hold of Nnamdi Azikiwe, took him to meetings with British colonial officials from Nigeria who were at the time in London, and finally arranged a meeting between him and a team of people from the colonial office. And what seemed to have happened in those meetings is that the British wanted to construct the Igbo and the Yoruba as enemies of one another, so that they would not be able to collaborate, because these are the two most powerful people in Nigeria. If the Yoruba and Igbo collaborated, the British thought that that would be the end of all the benefits from their colonial endeavor in Nigeria. And so Azikiwe arrived in Nigeria, the man who had left London with very high sounding ideas of the black race, the black man, and so on, Pan-Africanism and etc., arrived in Nigeria not so much dedicated to those ideals anymore, and so on. But as I said, we, the Yoruba and the Igbo, we allowed ourselves to be pitted against each other. I don't want to tell the story. The story I want to tell is the story of change and the future. We are now at a point in the history of the Yoruba and the Igbo nations when a substantial number of the Igbo and Yoruba people now recognize the following things. One, that because we had chosen to allow ourselves to be used against each other, the Yoruba nation and the Igbo nation allowed themselves to be used against each other in Nigeria, both have now ended up in a position that is only better than slavery in Nigeria. They have lost everything. And now they're just fumbling around in the hands of people who are dedicated to an idea that they must own Nigeria, they must rule Nigeria, they must control Nigeria. And they must make sure that the other peoples of Nigeria do not control their own destiny. That's what Ahmadu Bello said 11 days after independence in 1960, on October 12. The South we treat as conquered territory. We must treat the South as conquered territory and not let them ever rule over us and never let them control their own future. If he was prophesying that day, the prophecies have come true. If he was laying down marching orders for his people, they have succeeded in achieving what he wanted. That's the truth of the matter. So the Igbo must now learn. Okay, it's all right for us to be teaching our young people, our sons, to be abusing one another on the internet, on the social media, and so on and so forth. But we did it in the past. We have done it since the 1940s. And what we have earned from it is slavery in Nigeria. We can continue to do that and become more and more slaves in Nigeria, until maybe perhaps the Igbo and the Yoruba nations disappear. Maybe, but hopefully it is not going to be so. I was part of this Yoruba struggle from my undergraduate days in the 1950s. I was part of the Yoruba struggle when the rest of Nigeria combined in the National Assembly in 1962 and foisted a dictatorship over Yoruba land, a sole administrator appointed by the federal government. Those things rankle in the hearts of people. And then there are people, my friends, that are friends of mine, who are already grown up when the Civil War started in 1966. And the Igbo people were unbelievably brutalized. And we Yoruba took part in it. We were part of Nigeria. And for Nigeria, we were ready to raise our hands against our brothers, the Igbo people. Oh yeah, it has been horrible. It is time for us to turn around and begin to behave like the great nations that we are. We are not fools to be led in the nose, to hate one another, to be constantly pitched against one another, to seek advantages against one another in what is called the federal arrangement in Nigeria, the national cake. It is folly. It is time the Yoruba and the Igbo develop their own agenda of where they want to, what they want to be and where they want to do, what they want to do, where they want to be, and how they can collaborate and work together to achieve their purposes, rather than continue to rival one another for shares in the government of Nigeria. Sharing from the government of Nigeria is not the destiny of a great nation like the Igbo. It's not the destiny of a great nation like the Yoruba. Developing their own destiny, which Ahmadu Bello said we will not let them develop, is their real goal, is their real quest in the world. And it is time they began to do that. So fortunately, we are on the way to doing that. In early 2017, some very major step was taken. The newly elected leadership of Ohaneze sent a delegation under the newly elected president, Nwanze, to come and meet with Afenifere in Lagos. That was a landmark step. I was there the day Nwanze brought his delegation. And that night, I shed tears of joy, because I had never believed I would see that. I had participated in discussions around Chief Awolowo as one of the young intellectuals from Ife, in which we had very definitively decided that the road forward for either the Yoruba or the Igbo is that the two of them must learn to work together. But nothing had come out of those discussions. In 1984, May, after I was released from detention by the military ruler Buhari, Chief Awolowo invited me to Kenya, and we spent a whole day together at his house. And I want you to listen to this, let everybody listen to this, because it's a story that I need to be telling, to be standing on rooftops in Igbo land and Yoruba land and be shouting. We spend the whole day, Chief Awolowo, usually when we meet, it's about Nigeria, and we spend the whole day talking about the prospects, the difficulties, the plan, and so on and so forth for Nigeria. And then it was time for us to go to dinner about 4:35. And as we stood and went towards the dining table, Chief Awolowo stopped me and held my hand and said, Banji, there is something more I should not forget to tell you. So I stopped and looked at him, and he said, Banji, we Yoruba must find a way to work with Igbo. I said, you and Igbo will work together. It's not a question of must now. You and Igbo, he was now talking as if he was prophesying. He had started by saying you and Igbo must work together. But then he upgraded his talk to something like a prophecy. You and Igbo will work together. It is the only way you can be free in the world. It is the only way we can be free in the world. It is the only way we can really achieve what we deserve in the world. You and Igbo will work together. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I'm quoting him as much as I can remember. I am not saying it is going to be easy, but I am saying it will be done. That was May. I can't remember the date. I was released from detention end of April or early May. And I went to see Papa about 5 or 6 days later and spent the whole day. It was at the end of that day that Papa said that to me.
Prof, may we round up, please?
Yeah. You and Igbo will work together. It is only when you do that that you will achieve your goals in this world, your destiny, your deserved destiny. As he was talking, there was a knock on the door. It was one of our other leaders, Saolane Ajayi. Saolane Ajayi came in and joined us. Papa said, Alane, come and hear what I'm saying to Banji here. And so Saolane Ajayi joined us. He was wearing a suit. He apparently been for court or something. I don't know, because he's a lawyer. And he came and joined us. So there were 3 of us. And he said, Papa said, Banji, I have been telling you, and now I'm telling you, and Olane Ajayi, the Yoruba and Igbo will work together. It is when they do that that both of them will achieve their destiny in the world. And the 2 of us stood there and looked at Papa. Then we walked towards the dining table and we had dinner. And the day came to an end. I told this story in 2017. I told it when we were planning Handshake Across the Niger. And it was one of the motivators of the movement that produced the Handshake Across the Niger. I was the chairman of the committee that planned Handshake Across the Niger. We had members from the Yoruba diaspora abroad, from the Igbo diaspora abroad, the Yoruba intellectuals in Nigeria, and so on and so forth. We even wrote a book by 2 young professors, one Yoruba, one Igbo, Akintoye and Ojiako. And I wrote the foreword to that book. Sometimes when I go back to read that foreword, I have tears in my eyes. I said in that foreword, given the predominant character of the relationship between the Yoruba and the Igbo nations in the past 6 decades in Nigeria, writing the foreword to a book proclaiming any joint Yoruba-Igbo celebration of anything must be, for any Yoruba or Igbo person, a profoundly emotional encounter with history. But when God's time comes, it comes. But when God's time comes, it comes. Whether in the life of an individual human, or in the life of a nation, or of nations, But time has come in the lives and the relationship of the Igbo and the Yoruba nations of Nigeria. And when God's almighty hand is stretched forth, nothing can bend it back. Yes, God's time has come. God's time has come in the affairs of the Yoruba and the Igbo. And we have all better realized it. All of us young men and women and old men and women and all politicians and so on. This is the time when the Yoruba people and the Igbo people must learn to join hands together to put together their enormous capabilities and achieve for themselves their true destiny in the world. I want to say that personally, I have been very happy whenever I remember the little I have contributed to this. Following upon the handshake across the Niger, which was a huge festival, when all our leaders just went out, when we Yoruba from the southwest were welcomed into Enugu as we were princes from some great kingdom of the world. I say these are brothers, the our Yoruba brothers, you know, all princes, the Igbo princes, welcoming the Yoruba princes to their city and so on. It was a wonderful experience. And the result has been that more and more of our intellectuals have been doing research in the historical and cultural relationships of the Igbo and the Yoruba. And we are now finding that we are essentially one people, the Yoruba and Igbo, we are essentially one people who were separated over a long time in their history and have developed their peculiarities that may be different, but also have a great deal of commonalities in our culture, in our language, and so on and so forth. That is being discovered day by day, and I followed the research. It is exciting. We are one people, and we are not just the one people. There are other peoples who share the same family relationship in the Nigerian context. The Gala,
Prof.
the Edo,
Prof.
the Gbagi in the north,
Professor.
the Nupe, whom the Yoruba call Tapa, and so on. We were the same people originally, according to archaeologists. We formed as separate groups on the Niger in about, we were already there in about 38 BC as hunters-gatherers along the banks of the river. This is from the very best of archaeological research in our time, published mostly in the 1950s and the 1960s. But we were too hostile to one another and we were too busy fighting one another that we didn't see it. We didn't see the scholarship. We didn't see the fact that we are being rolled out by the best of scholarship in archaeology.
Professor Akintoye.
Now DNA research is adding to that. And we are getting to know more and more that these people called the Yoruba and these people called the Igbo have a great deal in common in their history, in their culture, in their everything. The research is going on. And some of our young intellectuals are excitedly pursuing the research. But the last dregs of the hostility is still out there. You open your social media and some Yoruba boy, Yoruba and boy and some Igbo boys are fighting one another and saying horrible things about the Yoruba nation, about the Igbo nation. It is backwardness. Young people should not be backwardness. They should be the people leading their nation forward. So I want to appeal to our young people. Lead us forward. The future belongs to you more than to people like me. I'm an old man. But it will give me great joy if I can see our young people, all of them, Igbo, Yoruba, and so on, really begin to treat one another as brothers. Really begin to treat one another as brothers and sisters.
Professor Akintoye, sir. I hope you can hear us. We seem to have lost your sound. Okay, Joe, can we come back to you?
Thank you.